It's the home stretch of Germany's federal election campaign, and Angela Merkel's exactly where she didn't want to be, back on the campaign trail. The outgoing chancellor of 16 years, seen here Tuesday in her home constituency on the Baltic Sea, stumping for her struggling would-be successor as head of the Christian Demcrats Armin Laschet. Other potential heirs have stumbled before him. Is it down to Laschet? Or has the woman who's been the dominant force in German and, dare we say, European politics all these years, sucked the oxygen from the room? In fact, polls suggest that voters want the candidate that's most like Merkel. And that just might be vice-chancellor and finance minister Olaf Scholz. He's the pragmatic center-left former mayor of Hamburg. How much a revival for the Social Democrats? Germans, by the way, do the opposite of the French. First, they pick a coalition, then they decide on a platform, and finally they agree on names. Some quip that on the Monday morning that follows the vote in Germany, and the ballots are counted, that's when it really begins to get interesting. This will be the first coalition formed since Brexit, a further ratcheting of tensions between the US and China, and of course that pandemic that's even seen Berlin bust the lid on spending caps. If, like last time, it takes months to form a government, it's not the Germans, but all of Europe that will be holding its breath. How long can we afford to wait? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking who to fill Merkel's shoes. With us, Cornelia Voll, professor of political science at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
From Berlin, CDU campaigner Jens Fischer, who's a debate coach. Welcome to the show.
Very good evening.
From Stuttgart, Michael Bloss, member of the European Parliament for the Greens. Thank you for being with us.
Hello.
And from Brussels, Sophie Ponschlegel, senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center think tank. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. We can show you images there of the German national anthem played at that Tuesday campaign rally in the northern port of Stralsund. Angela Merkel on home turf to sell that would-be successor.
As German Chancellor, Armin Laschet would continue the course of attracting new jobs here and make employment possible.
Your reaction, Cornelia Voll, to those images?
Well, it is interesting to see her back on the campaign trail, and it's also the decision to actually throw her weight in for Armin Laschet shows that he is in difficulty and that it's not so sure that he is her natural successor. It's, of course, the same party family, but in a way, Olaf Scholz, who is in the government right now, feels more like the incumbent and seems to signal more a continuation for those who don't want experiments.
Is he in difficulty of his own doing, or is it her fault?
It's an excellent question. I would say that it's his own doing, and in a way, his campaign has not taken off the way he hoped it would have. And what we also see is there were moments in the campaign, in particular the summer months and the floods, that have not been in his favor and that have really changed the projections in the turnaround that we have just experienced in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, Jens Fischer, that moment where he was, Armin Laschet was caught on camera chuckling or laughing, and people interpreted it as him taking lightly what was going on with those floods. Do you agree with Cornelia that it is Laschet that's perhaps the problem?
I disagree with him being the problem. I think the Chancellor is right that he would be the correct choice. That probably is not a surprise. The images were very unfortunate, and I think media has a role to play in this. The questions that were asked, the topics that were raised, also in the hardly called dual situation with three candidates for Chancellor, all of those lacked important issues, and I think we missed a chance for discussing those because we were focusing on persons so much.
We've seen debates, though, where there was hearty discussion and where there were perhaps, would you call them nuances or striking differences in policy?
That's a good question. I think the differences are bigger than what appears from the surface, because if you take Olaf Scholz, for instance, he looks like a center leftist, but if you look at the party behind him, people tend to be much more to the right. He's not the head of the party. He doesn't necessarily have the say. And as you said, the chancellor is picked after all the platform has been agreed upon. So it will be interesting to see what happens to the SPD after the election.
You agree with that, Sophie Pornschlegel?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear. Do you agree that actually Scholz is perhaps not entirely in sync with his own party?
It's true that it's interesting to see that the Social Democratic Party program is much more on the left than the candidate shows. So I think he's trying to really show that he has governmental experience, that he was in the Grand Coalition, so that he is a serious candidate. Whereas if you look at the program, it's much more ambitious or more progressive, you would say, on the socio-ecological transformation than the Conservatives. So I think you can see that there are real differences in the party programs, and I would agree with Jens to say that there are bigger differences if you look underneath. It's true that the candidate, the image they want to give is really that they're able to govern and that they all want to look very serious. Maybe one point that is interesting is that there's been a lot of talk shows, a lot of interest with the candidates for the chancellery, but Germany is still a parliamentarian system, so it's parliamentarian election and the parties behind them play a very important role.
The parties behind them play an important role. We'll talk about that more in a moment. First, so I want to ask you about the mood in Germany, because seen from the outside, we saw after 2015, the last election in 2017, we expected there would be this big backlash against Merkel for letting in migrants, and the far right did enter parliament, but not to the extent that some had predicted. We saw at that rally that we showed you from Tuesday night, there was booing by anti-vaxxers, and the country also in shock after last weekend's shooting, death of a 20-year-old student who was working as a petrol station attendant and got into a dispute with a customer who refused to wear a mask. Are vaccines, Sophie, the migrant issue, if you will, of 2021?
Personally, I think that it's interesting to see that the COVID-19 crisis did not really play a role in this campaign. For instance, health was not really on the agenda. I think the migrant issue came back a little bit with the Afghanistan crisis, but it wasn't really, as was mentioned before, it wasn't really a campaign that was focusing on policy issues at all. Maybe one point, I'm in Brussels and no one spoke about the EU, even though Germany is one of the biggest European countries. So it's interesting that it's been so focused on the people. There's been a lot of personal attacks. It was quite a vicious campaign, I think. So it's maybe not up to the size of the country, I would say, this campaign.
Not up to what the country's up to. Do you agree that with that, Michael Bloss, that there have been vicious attacks on the campaign trail?
There was a lot of attacks. I mean, I saw this on the campaign trail myself. A lot of anti-vax campaigners come to, for instance, all of the rallies of the Greens of Annalena Baerbock. But I also agree with what others have said, that we are not having a campaign or a whole election period where we talk a lot about differences in policies and we talk politics. There is a lot of talks about, how did Armin Laschet really smile? How are the looks? And this is really a little bit unpolitical, and it is not fit to the situation where we are in, where we have really big tasks to do in the future, and there are very different ways of how different parties and different politicians want to approach it. The climate for us and for me, of course, it's the biggest challenge we face in the future. It has been little addressed, and when it has been addressed, for instance, in the big debate, there was always the problem about how much will it cost to actually adapt to the climate crisis, and not the question, how much will it cost if we do not act now?
Yeah, climate not getting enough traction, you're saying. Now, for a fleeting moment at the start of the summer, there was talk of Germany for the first time electing a green chancellor. Let's listen to that standard bearer, Annabel Baerbock.
We're the second opposition force in the country for the past 2 years. and it's like a sporting competition. There's a favourite and a challenger. So we're doing all that we can in this campaign to renew the government with our content and our people.
Why has she faded, Michael? Is it because of, well, like you were saying, not enough traction for these important issues like climate change? Or is it because there are internal divisions? The same, by the way, we're feeling ahead of the French presidential election campaign within the Greens, between those that are quote unquote pragmatic and those that are more ideological and for more purity within the party.
No, I don't believe at all that there is some kind of internal fragmentation within the Greens at this very moment. We are very united on many issues. Well, there has been some hiccups in the beginning of the campaign, but then actually it started very well. And we are still doing, compared to what has been achieved in the past, very good. Tomorrow we will see again one of the biggest climate strike in Europe. Lots of young people will go to the streets. They will not go to school. So, well, actually it is better for us than any other campaign before for the Greens. So currently we are still in a situation where we are just before the election. The polls are now very inaccurate. We do not really know where it goes. It can go up, it can stay like this, it can also go down. We are fighting for getting the best result that we can, and in order to be able to have a strong voice to save the climate. That's what we are doing right now.
Cornelia Vol, those surveys saying the Greens running on 15%, which would be better than 2017. It would be a higher score. Do you agree that the polling is inaccurate?
I think we have to be very careful with the polling for two reasons. There's always some margin of error and the votes are very close. But the second reason is we will, like in many countries, have a lot of postal votes. So these are sent in August. And a lot of the development of the projected votes might not actually account for what people were thinking in August. So there is some question about the percentage of people voting by mail and the exact state of the effect of, for example, the television debates that might not materialize in voting decisions.
All right, so we're going to have to wait on the postal ballots on Sunday night as well, something
Absolutely.
to think about. You've heard our panel say it's been too much about images and not enough about substance. Let's look at the potential frontrunner. Again, we're saying this cautiously. Olaf Scholz, who's posed as the Kanzlerin. That's the feminine tense in German for chancellor, a play on words as an allusion to Angela Merkel. There you see he's holding his hands in that triangle fashion. This is on the cover of Süddeutsche Zeitungs magazine. And the same Olaf Scholz, who in the past had the moniker Scholzomat, because he seemed kind of boring. And being boring is a vote getter in Germany still?
I think it is. I think in a way, although this is much about personality and the vicious attacks have been personal, there is the sense that it's also about parties and that you have to show competence. And the campaign of Olaf Scholz is really very successful and smart in that he has two things that he wants to put up. One is competence for Germany, that's the slogan. And the second half is respect for you. So he tries to address two things. First, he has the most experience in government, especially as finance minister, but also previously. And second, he has a minimalist election campaign on content, but he says, I'm interested in you and I will be respectful towards your achievements to the German citizens. And this minimalist campaign, which builds a lot more on the images of himself as finance minister being active, is actually quite successful. There are some policy issues that have come up, like the minimum wage, but I would say it's the most minimalist campaign you could possibly run.
I'll put aside the label boring, but when Scholz's tone, again, is it the closest of the major candidates to Merkel's?
He has, there is this joke, is Germany ready for a male chancellor, that he is playing on by having a campaign. One is, kann Kanzlerin, can he be the chancellorette, or however you translate this? And that is, of course, appealing also to the feminist sensitivities that some voters have. I think he is not necessarily the closest because Armin Laschet is of the same party, but he has the same lack of excitement, you could say, but a seriousness or nüchterness that the Germans would favor. And I think that is appealing, and that's a sign of competence.
Okay, not everyone back in Hamburg, where he was mayor, is convinced, though, by Scholz.
Früher eine Arbeitnehmerpartei, was sie aber jetzt nicht mehr ist. Die ist total abgedriftet, die hat überhaupt nicht mehr den Kontakt zu den Arbeitern.
Das ist die SPD hier in Hamburg natürlich die Traditionspartei. Und ich mutmaße mal, vielleicht hat man mitgekriegt, dass die anderen noch schlechter sind.
We realize the other parties are worse. That's hardly a rousing endorsement. Jens Fischer, what we've seen in Germany is also, by the way, what we've seen in Britain and what we've seen in France. The two major parties over time since World War II have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. Is that inevitable?
I don't think it's necessarily inevitable. In this campaign, I think it's important to mention to the viewers that this is the first time in post-war Germany that the sitting chancellor is not standing for office again, which means for the first time we're actually electing a new chancellor. Before, it has always been changes within the legislature. And so I think this is also partly an explanation why it has focused on persons so much, because we want to know who will be the next leader. So that's an important discussion that has been going on. With Scholz, I think he is the laughing third, if you will, because a lot of people expected this campaign to be about a clash between the Greens and the Christian Democrats. Which type of value system would be better to tackle climate change, to tackle the future? And out of this emerged the SPD and Scholz, who now are leading in the polls, whereas they were trailing behind by 10 points or more for years. And so this is a very interesting change, with polling very inaccurate. We know that, or every serious pollster says that they don't know what will be the outcome, and so many uncertainties. A lot of people elected by mail, but many more people have asked for the ballot to be mailed and now are still holding it back. So only a small percentage has been sent in, because I think people sense that this is a big decision that has to be taken, one that defines the future of this country, and that they will still wait until the last day. And so I think what the changes are, we will see. People are on this, they are following it, and this is why the campaigns are also still going on till the last day to see what will be the actual result.
A change, but all the candidates, or at least the major contenders, are promising it won't be a radical departure.
How do you know that so specifically? Like I said before, the parties are more than the candidates. For the Christian Democrats, I would say, yes, this is the party of stability, and Mr. Laschet is the prime minister of a state already. So I think we have an idea what he's about, if you look beyond silly pictures that have been showed of him. With the other two, Mr. Scholz has been in the great situation during COVID to lash out hundreds of millions of euros, literally, which I think is something that a lot of people are grateful for, rightly so. It's not his doing. But other than that, what those parties actually will deliver in the end, I think, is largely open. There's a unison. We've heard this before. And of course, ranks are closing behind the candidates. And let's see after the elections how people will still hold their lines, or if new issues are going to come up, which have been part of this discussion before, all the time.
We're going to pick up on that point with the rest of our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're in the home stretch of Germany's federal elections, and this time around, the outgoing chancellor of 16 years is not on the ballot. Who to replace Angela Merkel? We're talking about it with Cornelia Voll, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. From Berlin, CDU campaigner Jens Fischer is with us. From Stuttgart, Michael Bloss, MEP for member of the European Parliament for the Greens, and from Brussels, Sophie Pornschlegel, senior policy analyst at the European Policy Center. It's time to play a game, which is discover what the next coalition might look like. Currently, Angela Merkel heads what the Germans call a GroKo, a grand coalition, which means it brings together the two historic center-right and center-left parties, the CDU and the CDU-CSU and the SPD. For a fleeting moment at the start of the summer, there was talk of that maybe could be the Greens in the driver's seat. And now, okay, here we have all the color-coded options, a Mickey Mouse coalition, which would bring in the Liberals of the FDP and the CDU and the SPD, kind of like a grand coalition, a Kenya coalition, a traffic light coalition, a Jamaica coalition, an R2G coalition, which would include the left-wing Die Linke party and the Greens with the Social Democrats. So there you see just some of the options there. Now it's interesting, Michael Bloss, you hail from Stuttgart, which is the one region in Germany where the Greens are in power, and you're in coalition with the Christian Demcrats, something that would have been unthinkable when the Greens were started back in the 1980s. When you look at all the various scenarios, are all the options on the table?
Well, we will see whether all the options will be on the table on Sunday evening. Currently, we don't know yet. I just hear that there are so many different names. Mickey Mouse Coalition, I've never heard before. But
apparently, it's because of the way, it's because of the colors of Mickey Mouse's garb that they're saying.
That's fine. I mean, I hope it will be I mean, that's what we know. We try to put forward. We say this should be a coalition that really brings Germany forward. So this should be a progressive coalition that is actually able to deal with all of the challenges we face. So,
what's it like in Baden-Württemberg, the Greens with the CDU? How does it work? Is it going well?
Yeah, currently it's going well. We had this is the second time we have this kind of coalition. In the last legislature, it was a bit bumpy, and currently it's actually going well. Also, this is because in the elections that happened in March this year, the Greens won, we won, and the Conservatives, the Christian Democrats, they lost. So their strategy of actually being the one who is stopping things that have been agreed before did not work out well. So now it is actually working quite smoothly.
So, Sophie Bornschlegel, you realize that on this side of the Rhine, we're very confused when we hear about this kind of scenarios. For us in France, you're either left-wing or right-wing. And in fact, the saying Macron, which claimed to be neither, is now more perceived as leaning towards the right. Is it really that open? Are the Germans really that open-minded?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. I would say that it's definitely a more consensual political system that is less confrontative, and you have to negotiate. And I think at the current stage, it's clear that all we know is that it is going to be extremely uncertain, because we don't know if the polls are right. We know that it's probably going to be a three-party coalition. My own belief is that it's going to be either a traffic light or a Jamaica coalition, because I don't see a grand coalition happening again. So I don't see the Social Democrats and the Conservatives working together, mostly also because from the Social Democratic side, I think they were very low in the polls in the last years and thought that it didn't help them. So I think, but even those two coalitions, so either Jamaica or the traffic light one, are difficult negotiations. So I think from a Brussels perspective, we expect to not have a German government till the end of the year, and that will also affect EU policy, of course.
Not till the end of the year. Cornelia Voll, that's bad news for Emmanuel Macron. Whoever the chancellor is, he needs someone in charge who's got a government.
He definitely needs somebody in charge for his own council presidency, which is starting in the beginning of next year. So yes, French experts are looking at this and hoping it'll be the shortest possible negotiations. But we also know that coalition talks do take time. And it is true that the big change, other than Angela Merkel leaving, is that we're probably going to see the end of the Grand Coalition. And that means there's some very substantial issues that have to be addressed, and which will be addressed once we know the distribution of votes. So it's going to be a long negotiation.
And we saw at the penultimate candidates debate the argument between the CDU's Armin Laschet. He was arguing for a minimum wage at €8.50, and Olaf Scholz was saying, no, it should be €12. It's interesting that the reputation of Germany has of being strict fiscal hawks is easing slightly after this pandemic?
there's parties that will still pride themselves on being fiscal hawks and others who are pushing in the other direction. And it's true that in a way it's a boring campaign, even though there are turnarounds, because we are oriented towards a consensus. Everybody knows that they will have to enter the coalition talks afterwards, so they can't shoot at the programs as if none of this is acceptable, unless there's really red lines that need to be drawn, and that's not the case of in this trilateral dual trial situation that we've seen.
So if we're looking ahead, I won't even bother Jens Fischer asking you which coalition works, because you've told me the polls are unreliable. But I will ask you this question instead. Germany, like the rest of Europe, is watching rising fuel and rent prices. It's now got its highest inflation rate since 2008, 3.4%. It might be a blip, or it might be a serious rise of inflation that's here to stay. And so who's going to play kingmaker, you think, come Monday morning?
Out of the inflation question, or where's this
coming
heading?
out of the
Sorry.
inflation question, is it going to be who's going to play the kingmaker? Is it going to be a party like the Greens, or is it going to be a party more like the FDP, the Liberals, who are fiscal hawks?
Well, people can still decide, obviously. I mean, Angela Merkel's chancellorship was forged in crisis. If you look at this from the beginning, there has been the housing crisis, there's been the debt crisis, the euro crisis, the refugee crisis. I'm missing one, I think, the corona crisis, obviously. And still, Germany came out very well in economic terms. And so the interesting question is, to what extent do Germans love that system and think this is the way forward, or do they think important change is coming? And then between these two, it's about regulations, which it has been called a progressive government, but there would probably be new regulations on government, on industry, sorry. Or will it be a relatively liberal government that helps industry to get out of the crisis and also to transition to a greener, more sustainable, CO2 neutral economy? And this is a great question that I think has been under-debated so far, where not a lot of exchange has been happening. Everybody has their plans, but that, I think, will be a crucial question come Sunday and then afterwards. For me, I hope it's going to be more on the liberal side of things, but we'll see.
So Jens, let me ask you personally, and not speaking in the name of the CDU, but
I don't do that anyways, but fair, yeah.
Okay, let me ask you personally: should Germany return to the fiscal purity of old and honor? It's in the constitution that you have to have a balanced budget, or have times changed and you support the fact that for the first time now you have this pooling of debt at the European level?
I don't think the pooling of debt is a good idea. I'm more in favor of this idea of a stability union where everybody has to look after their own finances. Also because I think it's very difficult to explain to German taxpayers, specifically those who are not making very much money, why they should pay for the debt of others that they have no control over. So that's a political answer to some extent. But if you look at the unbelievable amount of new debt that has been amassed throughout the corona crisis, I mentioned this, hundreds of billions of euros, I'm more in favor of going back to fiscal prudency because otherwise I don't see how this will ever be reined in. And then, for me, I don't see a way out of that other than growth and a better economy, which has other issues, like, for instance, CO2 reliability. So for me, it would be more, let's be prudent. Let's make sure that business can work their way. Let's make sure that innovation is happening. And let's make sure that we have good and well-paid work for the future. As long as all of those are happening, I would be content, but then we still have to tackle the big issue of climate change and some others.
Michael Bloss, you agree that it's better to return to what you just heard Jens describe as fiscal prudence?
No, absolutely not. I mean, what we were doing is actually not investing into infrastructure, into also public buildings, into schools, kindergartens, but also into the transition away from fossil fuels. And that clearly is also taking debt from future generations. So, of course, we need to have bigger investments now that will actually help our economy to be more future-proof, to be actually able to compete with other economies like in the US, like China, that are actually having huge investment programs. So I think this is also, it would have been nice to really debate more about this question, because this is about how should the future of Germany and Europe look like. I believe that this prudency argument is very inward looking. It does not look to the outside world, what is actually happening, what do we need. It is not really future proof. But also, just to bring back the coalition question back again, I would not say that a grand coalition could not continue with the Social Democrats, for instance, now in front, because this is what Scholz is all about. As you described him, you know, this is the Merkel 2.0. And thus, even though the party program is much more progressive, I think that Scholz himself is more like a grand coalition guy instead of a guy who is really now doing things differently and investing, for instance, in the future.
All right, another.
You mind if I interject?
Go ahead, sure.
Just very briefly, I'm not in total disagreement. What I would like to mention is that a lot of the investments that were just mentioned also have to come through our federal states, so the Länder. And in those, I always forget the number, 12 or 13, the Greens are in government as well. So I think it's a bit of a lame argument to say it has to change on the federal level to get more investment going, because nobody really disagrees that investment is important and that it's happening. What is more important is the planning gets easier, it gets more efficient to really get things done, rather than have very long processes and a lot of administration around it. So it's not just the money question, there's a lot more connected to this.
Nice that we debated, but the problem is that the federal states, they are actually bound by law and by the constitution to have a balanced sheet. So they are not allowed to spend that well and to invest so much. So it has to be the federal level that actually is investing. So that's the big problem that we are facing in the last years. There's too little investment, and it has to be solved on the federal level.
Michael Bloss raising,
yes.
Michael Bloss raising the alarm for him as agreeing that Olaf Scholz as Chancellor would go for another grand coalition. Another possible coalition for the SPD is with the Greens and Die Linke, the left which splintered from the Social Democrats, but whose support is rooted in the former East Germany. Die Linke in favor of leaving NATO, closer ties with Russia, a point that's been underlined time and again on the campaign trail by opponents of an eventual red-green-pink coalition.
Anti-Europeans, anti-NATO fighters do not belong in the German government. This is the very clear message which counts.
So, Michael Bloss, would you be in favor of a coalition where the Greens were sitting with Die Linke?
Well, I'm certainly skeptical about this option because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of things that we have not in common. So there will be some huge shifts, for instance, on the position in foreign policy. But I would never say that we exclude such an option. I think it could be one of the progressive options that brings Germany forward. Then it is much more about also bringing more justice into the system. So it's an option, but there are many more options. I would actually prefer to have a government with the Social Democrats and the Greens alone, and this is also still possible.
Sophie Pornschlegel, your thoughts on the scenario that's most likely at this point?
I mean, I mentioned it before, I think it's the traffic light or the Jamaica coalition. I do not see our R2G coalition either, mostly because of foreign and defense policy. The left is particularly anti-NATO, anti-army, and also anti-EU to a certain point. So I think it will be very difficult to bring those very radical positions together with the more centrist lines of the Social Democrats and the Greens. And maybe to make one point on the discussion before, I think there was one aspect missing to that debate of fiscal austerity or not, is that the European level has not been mentioned. And I think looking at the recovery, we know that the national level is not the right one to discuss those issues. So it would have been nice to mention Next Generation EU recovery package and to see that we need to find an answer to such an economic crisis as we have at EU level rather than at national level. So yeah, I think that this has been really missing out of the debate as well.
So Sophie, if we understand you correctly, you're arguing that in the future, the decision, the planning on big infrastructure spending should come more at the European level?
I think that we need to discuss it much more at European level, and the competences when it comes to the single market and the economy are already at EU level. So I do not understand how in this whole campaign none of the parties have even mentioned the EU, and you haven't been really able to see what the differences are from the political parties on their EU policies. And I think it's really actually quite problematic from such a big country like Germany that it hasn't been discussed, because as you could see in the discussion that there are different positions on how much should we invest, in which direction should we invest, should we make sure that we have a better trade, and within also the systems competition that we see with China and the US. So to be a bit more outward looking and to see that Germany is not just one country, but really a country embedded in the EU and then also in a more global context.
Cornelia Voll, what we have seen through Angela Merkel's leadership, particularly under the Trump years and even today, is after Brexit, Germany is the dominant force in Europe, more than the French. And do you agree that there's not enough talk about Germany's role and responsibility on the European stage?
There's not enough talk about it, mainly because the foreign policy issues and even the European question is a divisive issue. And it's something that is bad for the political campaigns of the candidates, so they're trying to avoid it. Let's talk about
Why is it bad to talk about it?
Well, because you realize how much within your own party there's divisions on certain issues. Let's talk about the possible coalition with Die Linke, the left party, for SPD. It would be very difficult because we have a left party that says we want to get out of NATO and into a security alliance with Russia. That means that then all of a sudden the SPD has to make up their collective mind. Is that an acceptable option? And it might be for the left wing of the SPD. It will certainly not be for somebody like Olaf Scholz. And so,
sorry to interrupt. How would that work? Could you make the Die Linke, in charge of the Ministry of Health and keep the SPD in charge of defense and foreign policy?
That's possible. A good point to discuss with them, and maybe that's how the discussions will go. But still, at one point you have to write the program. It has to be black and white. Right. What is your security policy? And it will be very difficult to come to a common point with Die Linke if it's for the SPD to make. So I'm relatively skeptical about this, but it has to be a possibility, because if not, somebody like Olaf Scholz, the SPD, will have to negotiate with for example, the Liberals as the only option, because they have excluded somebody too early. So right now, everybody has an interest in saying all possibilities are on the table. And that means that the really divisive issues, and this is foreign policy and also some of the European questions, are better left untouched.
Final question for you. Will you miss Angela Merkel?
I will miss her, but you get so used to somebody after 16 years that I think it's natural when you have a period of change.
Michael Bloss, off the record, will you miss her too?
Well, she actually was very present in most of my political life. So for me also, I believe it's good that we start something new now. And I hope that we really achieve on Sunday something that is also bringing Europe more together. Like how often did Macron come to Angela Merkel to try something like European sovereignty? Well, he failed all the time. I hope the next time he comes to a German new government, he will not fail.
Jens Fischer, can someone fill her shoes?
I absolutely think so. I'm going to miss her as well, but because I knew her well. And I think we have a bright future ahead. Actually, whoever will be the next chancellor, I think Armin Laschet is the best person for this, but that's up for the debate. I wholeheartedly agree with Sophie on more cooperation on international issues. There's security, there's climate, there's economy, there's so many issues that we need more integration. And I really hope for this discussion to continue and to bring new ideas and new concepts on the table.
Sophie Pornschlegel, what will be Angela Merkel's legacy?
Oh, I got the big question. Especially looking at European level, I think there are crisis management skills, her calm and pragmatic style during the European Councils, maybe when she eats chips in Brussels. But generally, I think she really left a mark in the 16 years. She was really there for the whole crisis decade, I would say. But maybe one last point would be to say that democratic change is never bad. So let's see who will be the next chancellor.
And we will know on Sunday night. Monty Francis will be sitting in this chair for special coverage here on France 24. I will be in Berlin for a special edition in partnership with Deutsche Welle on Monday. I want to thank you so much, Sophie Pornschlegel, for for joining us from Brussels. Jens Fischer in Berlin, Michael Bloss in Stuttgart, Cornelia Woll. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.